Hey guys, so before we get into today's video, I wanted to recommend everyone check out the Saints Unscripted Faith and Belief videos. These videos do an excellent job of breaking down the controversial topics many church members struggle with or don't understand. David Snell is a legend.
Hey guys, welcome back to another episode. Today we're going to talk about the relationship between the Latter-day Saint Temple Endowment and Freemasonry. We've got no time to wait. All right, polygamy episode.
Talking about some rather controversial issues having to do with race in the history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
The content is great, faithful, detailed, and perfect for anyone who works with youth in the church. It's important that we discuss the hard issues in the church, and David's videos on Saints Unscripted are a great resource. So go to YouTube and search for Saints Unscripted, and then check out their Faith and Beliefs videos. You won't regret it. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's episode. Today, joining me is my good friend Luke Hansen. Luke, how are you?
Doing well. Excited to talk about this. How are you doing,
Awesome.
Jacob?
Doing well. And just so everyone knows, Luke and I are not related, and our last names are spelled differently. Luke has the false way of spelling Hansen, S-O-N, and I have the true Danish way of spelling it with S-E-N. So,
I've already debunked that, so I won't do that here.
well, real quick, Luke, tell everybody just a quick thing about yourself, and so that way they know a little bit about you.
Yeah, so people have probably maybe seen me around on this channel, possibly on Quick Media, possibly on Midnight Mormons. And on our own channel, which is the Cougar Chronicle, which is an organization that I co-started about a year ago, officially, with a friend of mine, Tommy Stevenson. And we're like a first faith-based and second conservative news and community group at BYU. So yeah,
Awesome.
That's me.
Awesome. Very cool. Well, I've seen you around, and obviously I've really enjoyed your stuff, and we've interacted before. So today we're going to be doing a little couple of videos here, I think, maybe even 3 videos on the political philosophy of nuance ho is kind of what I wanted to label this. For those who are out there who may not know who Nuance Ho is, she is a prominent ex-Mormon icon kind of in the YouTube and TikTok sphere, gets a lot of views. And she has some pretty interesting political opinions that we thought we'd kind of analyze and go through some of that. But before we get to it, something I wanted to do, and Luke, I kind of mentioned this to you, is I want to do a little bit of a preface beforehand. Because I don't know about you, but Luke, have you noticed that when people leave the church that there are changes in their kind of socio-political points of view?
Yeah, and actually this was an episode that the Midnight Mormons did recently where they were looking at 2 other people, RFM and Bill Reel, talking to a third guy who had left the church. And he basically said, yeah, all the good people, the liberals, he like equated those 2 together, have already left. And it's only the conservatives left in the church. So it really seems like, except for a few cases, we have some right-wing people that leave the church because they're not being strong enough on, whatever the topic is, usually family proclamation stuff. But the vast majority of people are leaving the church. It really seems like they're sliding over to the left. And that actually seems to make sense to an extent with the worldview that political philosophy adopts versus what the gospel seems to suggest as a baseline political philosophy for people to start from.
Yeah, and I want to kind of preface this with we're using a lot of labels here. I'm fully aware of President Nelson's. I actually don't like to use political labeling myself personally. If people notice, I kind of avoid it on the show, and in this one we're going to talk a lot more about it. But I want to be very careful because I hate it when it's like, oh well, they're X, they're conservative, and therefore you can just write them off. Or they're liberal, and then that means you can write them off. Or they're woke, and then you can write them off, or whatever. I actually like to get into the actual philosophies behind these, because I think that when you actually dig into them, you'll find that there are like kernels of truth in most worldviews, but that they're distorted in some way. And I'm not one of these guys who's like, the proper political position is right in the middle of all of them. Like, I'm not like, I would say my political persuasion is I'm a Zionist in the sense of not like the Zionist movement that actually exists out there, but like Latter-day Saint. Like I want to establish Zion in the world, right? And
yeah. And we were careful about this kind of thing when we made the mission statement for the Cougar Chronicle. We said our mission is to spread the conservative perspective through the lens of the restored gospel of Jesus Christ. So that comes first. But
Yeah.
I think the political philosophy that you construct for yourself should be emergent from your political principles. And when I use the labels
from religious principles, you
sorry,
mean?
yes,
Yeah.
yes, that's what I do mean. Yes, they should be connected in some way. If they're disconnected, you're approaching things in a rather weird and fragmented way that I think is harmful, actually, to just your own cohesion as a person. But that's all I have for now. Yeah.
Well, that and I want to dig in a little bit to the political landscape ideologically, kind of from a philosophical lens, because I must admit I was very impressed by Nuance Ho's depth of political philosophy that she understood. And if you sense a little sarcasm in that's because I am being sarcastic. I was actually quite disappointed at the level of conversation, but we'll get into theirs. But what I want to do first is kind of zoom out and talk about political philosophy and kind of the political landscape. And I'm interested in what you think about this. I'm going to put it here on the screen for everybody to see. So this is my, I'll put our little faces on here too. Put us over here on the side. This is I'm laying this out here as sort of my provisional model here of the way that I look at politics. Okay. So the first axis here, and people have seen something similar, but I'll tell them where mine is different, right? You have authoritarian versus libertarian, right? Now, this is truly the political question as I see it. This is, you want to use the instrument of government to use or to create laws. And I have to tell people, like, laws are not suggestions. They are coercion to make people do things they would not do otherwise, right? So the government, when you kind of boil it all down, the government is it's an instrument of force. It's an instrument of coercion. And that is ultimately rooted in violence, because the government will send people that will literally place their hands on you if you don't cooperate, and they will take you to jail. And so we're literally talking about physical force and even violence to get people to cooperate. And so the authoritarian axis, as we look at this, this political map, authoritarians are those who lean more towards, yes, I want to use the power of the state to do things, right? I want to use the force of government to make things happen. But the thing is, the question is, all right, well, but what do you want to make happen?
Yeah, because the thing is, everybody, even people, except for extremely dogmatic and people who really dig into the philosophy, I think for libertarian, everybody wants to use the power of the state to do stuff. I think almost exclusively, like the power of the state to stop people from murdering each other, or the other word that you might not be able to say without getting flagged on YouTube, each other, or those type of things. But the question then becomes, well, where's the line? And I think usually people take a maybe utilitarian view to it, or the state is granted power to prevent other excesses of force that are worse being used on people.
Yeah.
So like being invaded by another country, that would be a problem. So we need to tax you to get a military to protect from that. Or being murdered would be bad. So we need a police force. But then it gets into, well, not having healthcare would be bad. So we need, and then that's when people start dividing, generally, or is on those non-fundamental things that government generally covers, unless you're hardcore libertarian, in which case you might argue against some of those.
Yeah, you eventually get to where you're an anarchist or a voluntarist who just believes in the abolition of any sort of state at all. And that's obviously a whole different thing. But again, looking at this at the axis here, now let's look. So we have authoritarian or libertarian. I think we understand that. So I say that is the amount of like how willing you are to use force to make your worldview come about. But the left and right really is a measure, as I see it, of left being, I want to, like, I'm not okay with the status quo, with the I'm not okay with this, with the status quo ideologically, kind of in our society. Or a traditionalist says, I want to hold on to the status quo or some past notion of the way things have been in the past, that I'm trying to hold on to. And so there's a tension, right? There are those that take, we have society the way that it is. And then you say, well, I want to reform it, or kind of, I want to be very careful about reformation to this because I think what we have is something very good. And like, if I go to the Middle East and I'm in Iran, I'm a hardcore like leftist in the sense that I'm a hardcore reformer within that society. But then again, then you put me into some other society and I'm going to be much more like, we want to hold on to these traditions. You know, if I'm in a kind of a Western Judeo-Christian, or even like within the gospel, I would be more considered right wing because I believe that there are things here that I'm trying to preserve and hold on to. And I'm basically, and Thomas Sowell talks about this, that the right is a reaction to the reformers. You are as far right as the people are pushing left. So as people try and reform something, the traditionalists are reacting to that reformation saying, no, we want to, you know, we're the ones who are against the reform, right? And so that's the tension that exists between left and right.
And I think if you're going with that definition, then I would say conservative is not on this scale. Because traditionalist, if your political philosophy is just defined by the milieu that you live in, and like you were saying, if you're placed in a different one, you turn into a different politically oriented person according to that graph as you switch around, that's not going to be a very helpful framework to look at stuff if we're trying to define philosophies like progressivism, like Marxism, or like conservatism.
Yeah, because
And
those
so
are
I
going to
think
be relative. Those are going to be
Yeah,
relative
a
to the culture
conservative
that you're in.
I think a good definition of conservative, you should always be a conservative no matter what environment you're placed in, because you're starting with a different worldview than somebody else. That's how I approach conservatism. Whereas if just trying to maintain the status quo is deemed conservative, then that means that a Democrat was a liberal during Trump, and now they're conservative during Biden, and now if Trump gets back in office, they'll be a liberal again. And it's just like,
but we could zoom out a little bit on that and say there is a Western tradition, political tradition that we're a part of. And there are, we tend to look at that tradition as something that is good and overall, and we are very cautious towards reforming it because we believe that we have something that's of a lot of value. So I would say that within the given political context that I'm in, I'm a conservative. The question is, what are you trying to conserve? Well, we're trying to conserve the principles that we believe of the American founding that are worth preserving, right?
Yeah.
And we are resisting those who are trying to reform things that we don't believe should be reformed, or that if they are reformed can cause a lot of problems.
And Dallin H. Oakes, in his talk on the Constitution, highlighted moral agency multiple times. The government's role to not interfere with God-given moral agency. And so in that framework, I will maintain my identity or my worldview as a conservative, no matter if I'm living in America today, America 100 years ago, the Middle East today, Soviet Russia 100 years ago. I still remain a conservative because that worldview of government being instituted to protect moral agency of individuals remains constant no matter what milieu I exist in as a political individual of that particular society.
Got it. Now, within kind of what I'm looking at here, obviously within the American context for a Latter-day Saint, if we believe that the Constitution was something divinely inspired, that's going to put pressure on us to move right, because we are trying to preserve the tradition of the United States Constitution, which we believe is something that is, divinely inspired. On the other hand, there are going to be those in the church that, say, well, there are still things that need to be reformed. And so that will push left. And that's sort of the tension that exists. I think the reason most Latter-day Saints fall onto the right side of the spectrum is because there's just a natural tendency to have a higher level of respect for the American tradition because of what our church teaches about that tradition very explicitly. Right. But then there's also the, the question of, all right, but authoritarian versus libertarian, the United States Constitution tends to be a libertarian document in restricting the power of the king. The United States tradition comes out of an authoritarian sort of milieu of the 1700s, and it was a libertarian document trying to get people to be, liberty was the cause of the American Revolution, at least from from that context where you were being ruled over by a king. So I think the church naturally has a tendency, and people can, say, well, I fall more to this side of the scale or whatever, but we have to admit that there's a pull in the church to pull people towards the right and towards libertarian views on government. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I think so. Although if you look at something like the Book of Mormon, and you look at some of the governments that they set up, there definitely is that libertarian aspect. But at the same time, we do have, like in the reign of the judges, something like adultery is outlawed, which today we would see more as if a state's getting involved with outlawing adultery between people, they're being very intrusive into people's personal lives. And so there is kind of relativistic aspect to this. But I think overall there is really that libertarian thing, because agency is so important in the gospel.
Absolutely.
And actually the real thing, maybe even more important than that, is man is a fallen creature. And so government, we cannot collect ourselves together. In our theology, we have this idea of we cannot collect ourselves together and impose a moral system and a Zion-like outcome, a utopia, onto society through government. It's not going to work, because imperfect people can't, without the influence of a perfect person like Jesus, band together and create perfection. But if there is no God to look up to and try and follow after, in a more atheistic perspective, then you are God. And it starts to become a lot more viable to use the power of the state to try to achieve a utopia, because there's no other power source to look to other than the government to make that happen.
Well, see, and that's what's interesting, because some people would say, well, your church is super authoritarian. You guys have all these rules you have to obey and all of that kind of stuff. And I look at that and I go, yeah, but the difference is we're not doing this by force. Like you voluntarily choose to take upon you the name of Christ. And yes, you voluntarily say, I'm going to live according to these laws because I believe that these laws will lead me towards salvation and exaltation. And so it's just fundamentally a different game that we're playing when we're saying, no, this is government plays the game where if you live within this geographical region, you have to do what we say or else. Where for us, it's like, you can choose to be a part of our church or not. You know what I mean? You're free to go. And so there's a big difference between, voluntarily submitting to a rigorous system of rules and laws versus saying, well, if you're within these geographical boundaries, like, we're going to come in and make you do what we want.
I think some people might say, well, it's a very authoritarian because they'll cut you off and they'll just make it socially not viable to leave the church. There's all this pressure. Like, okay, well, we don't live as individuals. We live in society. So there's always societal pressures to take into account. And last I checked, Brigham Young did not build the Berlin Wall around Salt Lake City in the 1860s. But other countries have done that. And so relative to what could happen, you're very free to leave.
Well, and I think one way to look at this, I put some specific things on the extremes of this scale to give people kind of an idea of the landscape as I see it. Because we are in the Western world. And so I'm bringing this map to the Western tradition, right? And in this Western world, we look at the world and, on one hand, you have, if you go to the far left, like hard reformers, people who are just against kind of the traditional Western liberal democracies, you run into, and then you go up the authoritarian scale, you get to Maoists. Maoists hate the West and they are as authoritarian as you can get, right? That or North Korea, like that's one end of the scale. Now, on the other side of the scale, you might have people who are fascist, or I would say theocrats, who utilize the violence and coercion of the state to impose a particular view of a tradition that they want to impose on everyone else, and basically say that our traditional values are going to be imposed, again, at the point of the gun, if necessary, right? And so that's where kind of that's why those two are cousins, because their common bonding thread is the rife authoritarianism that exists within them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then on the other hand, if you go to the hardcore libertarians, these are people that, like, you throw government out the window. Like, you're not into government. If you get to the, hippies, they kind of run, they think our Western values, man, they're just like super stifling, dude. And so they run off into a commune together, and they, we're not even going to have any government. And then that's kind of what the hippies are about,
Yep.
social
Mhm.
reformers, but not using the government to do it. And then on the other side of the scale, you have people like the Jehovah's Witnesses, who don't vote, don't get in the military, like basically try and walk away from any sort of authoritarian involvement in the state, and then, but have a very rigid, traditional kind of view, right? And so I think when you look at this and you understand that these are the dynamics that are at play, you can evaluate any given person, and you can see both where they are, but you can also see, like, what are the forces, like, where are the different forces pulling people? And so do you think that, people who leave the church, like you said, they move left. Do you think on this map, does that reflect, like, where are the forces on this map for someone who leaves the church once the church's kind of pull goes away?
I think people leaving the church, there are the people, and this doesn't seem as common anymore, who just like, I want to water ski on Sunday. It's like, okay, that's not necessarily a worldview motivated approach to leaving the church. But a lot of people leaving the church nowadays, at least the ones yelling about it on Twitter, seem to be ideologically driven. And it does seem to be that rejection of traditional structures because they're oppressive to people. And then also, hand in hand with that goes the demand for reform. And if those demands aren't being met to their satisfaction, they leave the church. But, the same thing applies politically. And so it seems that they will move both in that political direction as they leave the church. And the videos we're going to look at with Nuance Ho are kind of a case study of that.
Yeah, I agree.
In fact, in the videos, she basically, Republican, right-wing, evangelical, and Mormon are all sort of interchangeable terms. Like she and the other people that she's doing the videos with almost see them as basically the same thing when we're talking about worldview. Yeah.
And that's, you move towards that, obviously moving towards the left, like towards reforming the church. And then you're saying reforming this traditionalist society. And then there's a pressure upward towards authoritarianism, I feel like, because the government that's the tool. Like, that's the way that you make things happen. That's the way you change society. So
because generally they still care about making things better. But if you don't have God to do that, then really the only other thing you can look to is the government, because just us as individuals trying to be nice to each other obviously isn't cutting it. And so if we want change to happen, we've got to look to some sort of higher power than just ourselves. If it's not going to be God, then really the only other option is government. And that's when things start to get scary, in my opinion, and I think in history's opinion.
Absolutely. If we notice on this scale, the scariest parts aren't the hippies and the Jehovah's Witnesses. The scary part is when you move up, because that's when you use the violence and coercion of the state to make the world the way that you want it. Anything else before we get into the videos?
No, I think that's a good primer.
Perfect. Well, everyone, we'll catch you in the next episode. So do you enjoy the content here on Thoughtful Faith? If so, be sure to hit the notification bell. This ensures that our new videos show up on your feed. Also, be sure to check out our Facebook group called Thoughtful Saints, where myself and others discuss the sorts of topics found on this channel. And lastly, if you think other people would benefit from this video, please be sure to share it.